Tom Araya finally reveals why rockers refuse to work with Dave Mustaine. He's the guitarist who got kicked out of Metallica and built one of the biggest bands in metal out of pure spite. He's also, by his own bandmate's account, someone who can clear a room without even trying. Tom Araya rarely says much. That's exactly why, when he finally did talk about Dave Mustaine, people listened. He comes across as a nice guy, Araya said, but I keep my guard up around him. No shouting. No headline-grabbing insult. Just a quiet line from a most even-tempered man in thrash metal, and it told you everything you needed to know about 4 decades of history between two bands that should have been the best of friends, and instead spent most of that time keeping their distance. This is the real story of why the man behind Slayer never fully let his guard down around the man behind Megadeth, and why so many other musicians in that scene learned to do the same. The making of two rivals. Slayer formed in Huntington Park, California, in 1981, built by guitarist Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman around a sound that had almost nothing to do with subtlety. Tom Araya, brought in as bassist and vocalist, gave the band its anchor, a low, controlled howl underneath riffs that seemed determined to outrun themselves. Araya wasn't a screamer for the sake of it. He worked as a respiratory therapist in Slayer's early years, treating patients by day and playing to half-empty clubs by night, and that grounded, unglamorous streak stuck with him. Of the 4 original members, he and King are the only 2 who stayed with the band for its entire run. Dave Mustaine's story started differently with rejection. He'd been Metallica's lead guitarist until April 1983, when the band fired him over drinking and drug use and unpredictable behavior. Mustaine didn't quietly move on. He formed Megadeth almost immediately, driven by a well-documented need to prove he was faster, heavier, and more technical than the band that had just cut him loose. Albums like Peace Sells, but Who's Buying backed that ambition up. Mustaine was, by nearly every account, one of the most gifted guitarists to come out of the thrash scene. He was also, by nearly every account, difficult. The two bands' paths crossed earlier than most fans realize. In 1984, with Megadeth still finding its lineup, Mustaine and bassist David Ellefson recruited Kerry King to play second guitar. Slayer's future was briefly, genuinely uncertain. King played roughly 5 shows with Megadeth, still wearing his Slayer gear on Megadeth's stage. Ellefson later described watching King absorb Mustaine's playing on site, reproducing brutal riffs note for note after single listen. King has said he was in awe of Mustaine's ability going back to seeing him play with Metallica at the Whiskey. By his own description, it changed his life. It didn't last. King chose Slayer permanently after about 2 months. And what should have been the start of a friendship between 2 of thrash's most important guitarists instead became the opening chapter of one of the genre's longest-running feuds. A friendship that never took. Ask Kerry King why he left Megadeth, and he'll tell you it wasn't really about the music. Reflecting on it decades later, King said that if he and Mustaine had managed to coexist for years instead of months, Megadeth would have turned out very differently. Not necessarily better, just different. He's also been blunter about the reason it didn't happen. He doesn't understand how anyone lasts in a band with Mustaine for more than a couple of hours, calling him crazy in more than one interview. It's a joke King tells with real affection buried underneath it. He said flatly that he still loves Mustaine as a guitarist, but the affection has never stopped him from taking shots. And King has taken plenty. In 2004, asked point-blank what started his feud with Mustaine, King didn't hedge. He called him a prick, adding that anyone who'd spent real time around Mustaine would say the same. The following year, after Mustaine made public comments questioning King's talent, King fired back even harder, branding Megadeth's frontman miserable person in the press. This wasn't a rumor whispered through the scene. It played out in interview after interview, on the record, for over a decade. Mustaine, for his part, has generally taken the high road when King's name comes up, calling their relationship up and down, and crediting King as a great friend despite the sniping. A sign that whatever tension existed ran mostly one direction. But tension between 2 members of 2 different bands is one thing. What made the Slayer-Megadeth relationship genuinely strained was that this wasn't isolated to King. It shaped how the whole band, and eventually much of the scene around them, chose to deal with Mustaine. Thrash's Big Four and the one who stood apart. By the mid-1980s, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax had become thrash metal's Big Four, bands that toured together, shared producers, and pushed each other creatively even while chasing the same audience. It's worth noting Metallica is conspicuously absent from a lot of this story. Of the 4, they're the only one who never joined Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax on a shared package tour, in part because their popularity had already outgrown that format by the time the others were ready to team up. That left Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax to build the connective tissue of the scene themselves, most visibly through the Clash of the Titans tour. Launched in the fall of 1990 to support Megadeth's Rust in Peace and Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss, the European leg paired the two bands with Testament and Suicidal Tendencies for a run through Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, and the UK, culminating at Wembley Arena. A second North American leg in 1991 swapped in Anthrax as a third headliner and added a then-unknown opening act called Alice in Chains, who'd only landed the slot after original openers Death Angel were forced off the tour by a near-fatal bus crash. By most accounts, the tour was a genuine high point for the scene. Commercially, it's still considered one of the most successful package tours in metal history. But even amid the camaraderie, the old fault lines were visible if you knew where to look. Suicidal Tendencies frontman Mike Muir was asked at the time how things were going with Megadeth, and answered that he barely saw them, and that he was glad of it. Testament's Chuck Billy later recalled touring with Mustaine a few years earlier when he was still deep into drinking and drugs, only to find him newly sober and now the one lecturing other bands about smoking indoors, a whiplash the younger Testament crew found more amusing than welcome. There's also a lighter, stranger piece of Clash of the Titans lore that captures the mood backstage better than any feud recap could. Members of Megadeth and Anthrax have both described a full-blown food fight erupting during the tour. Accounts differ on how it started, with Ellefson recalling a slice of bread escalating into an entire flying turkey, and Anthrax's Scott Ian instead crediting Araya with launching a plate of fish that landed squarely on drummer Charlie Benanti's shoulder. Nobody involved describes it as anything but funny. It's a small detail, but it says something real. Even at the height of the king, Mustaine sniping, Araya himself was never the one throwing punches, verbal or otherwise. He was the guy in middle, more likely to start a food fight than a real one. The guarded man. That's what makes Araya's eventual comments about Mustaine land so differently than King's. Where King has spent 20 years openly trading insults with Mustaine in the press, Araya almost never engages. When he finally did, in a 2010 interview with Noise Creep, he didn't reach for anger. Asked directly whether he and Mustaine were friends after everything, Araya answered with something closer to detached honesty. Mustaine was, in his words, another human being who lives on this planet, and that's about it. He acknowledged Mustaine was courteous to him and his family, and said he was courteous in return, but followed it with the line that's since become the defining word on the relationship. He keeps his guard up. It's not a dramatic accusation. There's no smash guitar, no shouting match, no canceled record deal in it. It's just wariness, the kind that comes from watching someone's pattern of behavior play out for years without ever being burned by it directly. And Araya has, on other occasions, been a little more pointed about what that pattern looks like. In a separate interview around the same period, asked about a Megadeth/Slayer tour that had just wrapped in Canada, Araya offered a dry aside. Mustaine was lucky they'd done those dates at all, a comment he delivered with a laugh, but one that clearly wasn't entirely a joke. Pressed further on whether there was real tension between the bands, Araya described running into Mustaine only occasionally and treating him with basic human respect when he did, while making clear that nothing had really changed on his end. He was, as he put it, still just waiting for Mustaine to open his mouth. That's the through line in almost everything Araya has said about Mustaine over the years. Not fury, not betrayal, just a kind of tired familiarity with a cycle he'd watched play out too many times. Mustaine says something inflammatory. The backlash hits. He walks it back, sometimes apologizes, and then the cycle starts again. Araya never needed to raise his voice to make that observation land, which is probably exactly why it's the quote that stuck. Why the scene kept its distance. None of this stopped Slayer and Megadeth from sharing stages for decades. Thrash metal's economics more or less demanded it. The two bands reunited the Clash of the Titans lineup on the American Carnage Tour in 2010 and 2011, and joined Metallica and Anthrax for the long-awaited Big Four, shows that same era, finally bringing all four founding thrash bands together on one bill for the first time. Professionally, the relationship endured. Personally, it never fully thawed. Kerry King has continued needling Mustaine well into recent years, at one point summing up their entire dynamic by admitting he'll happily spend 20 minutes with Mustaine and then bolt before things get uncomfortable, is shorthand for a friendship that works fine in small, controlled doses and falls apart in anything longer. It's telling that even King, who's traded some of the harshest public insults of anyone in the scene, still frames it as bolting rather than breaking things off entirely. There's respect buried in the friction. There's just also a very clear sense of self-preservation. That combination, real admiration for Mustaine's talent, paired with a hard-earned instinct to keep him at arm's length, is really the through line of this entire story. It's there in King's needling, and it's there, quieter and more deliberate, in Araya's guarded courtesy. Neither man has ever denied Mustaine's gifts as a musician. Both have made clear, in their own very different registers, that gifts alone don't buy trust. What it says about thrash metal's founding generation. There's a version of this story that plays as pure drama, reckless guitarist, feuding bandmates, a scene built on chaos. The real version is a little less cinematic, and a lot more human. Two guitar players who idolized each other in 1980 never managed to make it work as bandmates. One of them spent the next 20 years saying so, loudly, in the press. The other one, the guy whose band Mustaine's almost collaborator ended up fronting instead, never raised his voice about it once. He just kept his guard up, showed Mustaine basic courtesy whenever their paths crossed, and let his silence do most of the talking. It's a reminder that in a genre defined by volume, some of the most lasting statements are the quiet ones. Tom Araya never needed a blow-up to make his point about Dave Mustaine. He just needed one honest sentence and 40 years of consistency to back it up.